Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you very much for having me here. Unfortunately, I don't speak Russian, even if I've come to Kazan quite a few times. I hope you will forgive me if we just speak English. Um, First of all, I would like to tell you that my talk will be about the brain correlates of language processing under the lens of some of the most recent findings from neuroimaging and neuromodulation techniques. The interest about the potential relation between brain lesions and what we might call today cognitive functions is quite ancient. Indeed, the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus that you see here is quite a very famous version of this old interest. Indeed, this papyrus, which was found like 200 years ago, give and take, is from 1700 before Christ even, so it's a very old one. And in this papyrus we can find for the first time the written word for brain is this hieroglyph here. But this is important mostly because it describes 24 clinical cases of patients with traumatic brain injuries. And these people, after the lesion, lost some of their previous skills. For example, some of them are described as having memory issues. For example, they are described in a very poetic way, like this. They could not even remember their name. They couldn't remember anything, not even their name. As for language, also in this case, there are two issues of two patients who are described as experiencing what we might call today a non-fluent aphasia with associated depressive disorder. They are described as being mute in their sadness. Well, let's say that anecdotal observations such as this suggest that even in such ancient times, there was some sort of reflection about the fact that, first of all, the brain controls behavior, which is not something so easygoing, actually, and that different cognitive skills, what we might call today different cognitive skills, such as memory, attention, language, perception, and so on, might be compromised after brain lesions in different parts of the brain. Let's say that with time, several theories and observations have been carried out about the implementation of cognition in the brain. It would be beyond the scope of this very short presentation to go through all these periods. However, we might say that during the 19th century, a major contribution to this topic was provided by French neuropsychologists, like, for example, Florent and Broca, English neurologists, and Austrian-German neuropsychologists, let's say von Meinert, Theodor von Meinert, Wernicke, Kussmaul, for example, or Lichtheim. In 1897, as you can see here, there is this very interesting review of the literature provided by this author, Testu, who provided a very interesting review of the available evidence at this time under the localizationist perspective. Here you can see the idea that as different parts of the cortical layer may contribute to different aspects of cognition. For example, there would be a specific area dedicated to, I don't know, speech output, another area dedicated to speech understanding, another area dedicated to memory, and so on. And the lesion of a specific area might lead, should lead under this perspective, to the destruction of this specific ability. Actually, this approach had also some drawbacks. For example, they could not even barely understand how a person could recover from a lesion. Because if you have an area, let's say Broca's area, destroyed, and that area is really the area of speaking, how is it possible that this given patient might recover the ability to speak. The area is destroyed, so how is it possible? Okay, in this review, you can see what they were thinking at the end of the 19th century. Area 1 here in the premotor cortex was called Exner area, from the neurologist Exner, who thought that this area was dedicated to writing. So here you see, second, what was thought to be Broca's area, dedicated to language output. And here 8 is Wernicke's area. Actually, it should be a bit more behind, but it's okay. Wernicke's area, which should be important, for example, for lexical understanding, linguistic understanding. And here, these two areas dedicated to reading, as they were found by Jules Desjardins in 1895, as compromised in an engineer who could not read anymore. Well, this observation and these approaches received further development during the second half of the 20th century. When, for example, Norman Geschwind in the Western country, is in Boston area, reformulated former Wernicke-Lichtenstein's model of language in what is called Wernicke-Geschwind model of language organization in the brain. This is a model everybody knows. I won't spend time onto it because it's also something that is not correctly representing how the brain is organized in relation to language. Let's say that with the development of neuroimaging techniques, former localizationist approaches have been gradually abandoned in favor of current associationist, let's say new associationist or odological approaches. According to this new approach, cognitive skills are simply too complex to be organized in just a bunch of areas, but too specific to be organized in the whole brain on the other side. The idea is that the cognitive functions are organized in neural networks spanning from cortical to subcortical and cerebellar areas with epicenters that are crucial nodes of the net. This really much resembles the ideas of great Alexander Romanovich Luria. I don't know if I pronounced it well. We have one of the most important scholars who studied with Luria, Tatiana, so I'm very honored to say these things in her presence. It's very interesting also, this possibility. But anyway, according to this associationist approach, the model, the contemporary associationist approach, so we have networks with epicenters, and if a specific node of the epicenter of the network is broken, then the corresponding function might be lowered. But then the patient might recover because other areas of the network might work in tandem, might work in concert in order to overcome the problem and create a fix to the net. Over the past 20 years, approximately, the development of several studies with neuroimaging techniques mostly have provided us with very new pieces of information about how the brain is organized according to language functions. For example, this is a very interesting meta-analysis carried out by colleague Uniud. He reanalyzed the results of hundreds of studies focusing on the cortical layer of the left hemisphere, in studies focusing on, for example, phonological processing or semantic processing or grammatical processing. Here I will show you just a few results. For example, in the left image here, you can see every blue spot, every blue dot, circle, is an area, a spot, which has been found active in one study, at least one study assessing phonological skills in the brain. The yellow triangles, I don't know if you can see them here, are spots that have been found active in several studies, so that we might consider them epicenters. And here on the right, you have the result of the meta-analysis showing the presence in the cortical layer of the left hemisphere of at least two corridors. One is frontal, and this highlighted area is what is generally spoken called Broca's area, let's say like this, because it's a very wide area from a cortical point of view. And you can see that just a little portion of Broca's area is involved in phonological processing, but you can see there are also areas in the motor cortices focusing on hands and face musculature, but also areas in the auditory, primary auditory cortex, and there is an interaction, a constant interaction between these two streams. It's interesting to observe as to this result that approximately 15 years ago, Imada and colleagues, Japanese colleagues, found out that in newborns, so children who are just born like from 2 hours, 3 hours of really newborns, if they listen to syllables outspoken in the language spoken by the mother during the carriage, these children had activation of auditory cortices. However, already at 3 months of age, they have, when they hear syllables, a co-activation of auditory cortices, especially leftolateralized, but not in all of them, and premotor cortices. This means that in this period, their brain is already associating acoustic configurations with schematic motoric configuration in order to reproduce the sounds they are beginning to recognize. Very interesting. Also, the semantic network is quite wide in the left hemisphere. Every red spot represents an area found active in one of the several studies focused on the meta-analysis. The golden triangles are again epicenters. Here you have the net. You see the network for semantic processing in the left hemisphere is quite broad. Also here we see the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, angular gyrus BL39, which is called also part of the Geschwin territory, and they are connected with areas in premotor cortices, especially these areas, again, Broca's area. And here you see the phonological networks was a bit more behind, whereas the semantic network is a bit more anterior. So they are not processed by the same areas in the left hemisphere, in the so-called Broca's area. Well, actually, also the right hemisphere plays a role in language. For many years, since the 90s, it's been thought that the right hemisphere was mainly implicated in pragmatic and discourse level processing. Actually, we know now that the right hemisphere is implicated also in microlinguistic processing, such as grammatical and lexical processing. For example, here you see the result of a study we carried out together with other colleagues here in Italy with different neuroimaging techniques. And in this study, we found out that in word generation tasks, verb generation tasks, and sentence comprehension tasks, there was a wide activation in the left hemisphere. You can see frontal areas, but also temporal areas, but also in the right hemisphere. So the right hemisphere is not a mute hemisphere, as for so much time in the Western countries been the dominant stream of knowledge. Now, I would like to focus with you on a neural network responsible for lexical production. I will make referral here to the very influent model proposed by Willem Leffeldt in 1989 in his book Speaking, which has been reformulated several times during time. The most recent version of the model is approximately 9 years old and is based also on neuroimaging techniques. According to this model, there would be, for example, naming tasks, there would be a former stage of conceptualization. In this stage, we just have to understand what our interlocutors would like to know from us. So we have to generate a mental model of their minds. We have to generate a theory of their minds, theory mind. but we also have to generate a communicative intention, which is basically the output, the beginning of the output process. And then we have to take into consideration, proper consideration, the context, the verbal context, but also the extra-linguistic context, and we have to take a perspective. Like this, we can finally generate the motivation to speak, and we know that this motivation to speak generation requires at least these three areas in both areas of the brain, in both cortices. We have orbitofrontal cortex here, BA47, BA11, that together with the anterior cingulate here, BA24, and the supplementary motor area in BA6, here is very up, we know that we simply generate the motivation to speak. We also know that a lesion affecting the anterior cingulate in BA6, in this very upper part of BA6, supplementary motor area, may determine transcortical motor aphasia. I think in Luria's term it should be a dynamic aphasia, if I remember correctly your classification, or adynamic aphasia maybe. And then after this network comes back in the background, and the stage is taken by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in both hemispheres. That is important for programming, monitoring, and inhibiting eventually what is to be said. Then after that, we need a lexical selection process that will convert these concepts that have been generated in our minds into lexical concepts. Let's say concepts for which we have a word in our mental lexicon in the language we are using at the moment. For this lexical selection process, which is based on spreading activation with inhibition of semantic competitors and selection of the target word lexical entry, we have a wide net considering the left temporal lobe, the temporal pole here, posterior aspect of the inferior temporal lobe in BA37, which in the left hemisphere is also called word form area, in the right hemisphere is also called face area. And then we have also mid portions of the inferior and middle temporal gyri, BA21 and BA20, and other portions of so-called Broca's area, left pars supercularis, BR44, and presentral sulcus in BA6, and then the involvement also the cerebellum, most specifically the dentate nucleus in the right cerebellar hemisphere. And we know this right hemisphere, right cerebellar hemisphere, through a network, through a net, going to the thalamus, getting into the inferior frontal gyrus, and coming back through the pons, again to the cerebellum. Then we have the phase of lexical access. Once we have found out the word, we need to get access to all the information stored in our semantic memory regarding that specific word. The first kind of information is lemma retrieval. At this stage of lemma retrieval, we understand what is the grammatical category of the word, and we know what is the role of this specific word in this specific sentence. In order to do this, we have again the activation of posterior aspects of parts of the Broca's area, so-called Broca's area. Then we have to get access to the phonological code. We have to retrieve the phonological code that will be implemented later on, and this phonological coding takes place in left auditory cortex, most specifically in the left plantar temporale. After that, we have to generate the syllables that will be responsible for further phonetic encoding of these phonemes. Here we have a wider set of areas, cortical, subcortical in the right and in the left hemisphere who take the stage, the left inferior frontal gyrus, ventral aspects of left presentral gyrus, but again, different aspects of temporal gyrus, left fusiform gyrus, left thalamus, and mid portions of the right cerebellar hemisphere. Then, after that, we have to plan the articulatory scores in supplementary motor area, the same area that was active at the beginning of the process, because at the beginning of the process we had to consider what to do in order to select the word. Now we have to consider what to plan in order to articulate the word. And then we can finally articulate the word by implementing this in the motor cortex, cerebellum, left thalamus, and basal ganglia. This is very interesting because there is also evidence of how this develops over time. For example, a few years ago in 2015, there was this very interesting systematic review of 22 former years of functional MRI focusing on language development. Well, in this study, the authors found very interesting issues. For example, they found null to mild effects of lateralization in the first place. So there are no significant effects on left lateralization of linguistic skills, mostly lexical and grammatical skills in the left hemisphere. Furthermore, they found out an increasing activation during growing times with the development of the children in semantic areas, semantic processing information areas. You see portions of ventral Broca's area, BA45, orbitofrontal cortex, but also different aspects of both inferior and middle temporal gyri, left and right hemisphere. There is also a growing activation with time, increasing age, in areas, bilateral areas important for sensory and motor controls while speaking, whereas for speaking there is a decreasing activation in areas, polar frontal areas, BA39, anterior cingulate, and other aspects of medial frontal areas that are more concerned with concentration while articulating words. And there is also a further decreasing in activation in precuneus here at BA7 and posterior cingulate cortex BA31 and BA23, that are involved in so-called default network, but also in behavioral control. Overall, these pieces of evidence suggest that with increasing age in children, there is a gradual reduction that may reflect the takeover automatic. Yeah, it has sensory motor processes while perceiving and producing samples of speech. As a last issue that I would like to discuss with you, I think I need still 5 minutes. I think I have time because I began at 35. I would like to discuss with you the potential relation of all these pieces of information on rehabilitation. This is a story that began quite a long time ago, 15 years ago. We were working, me and my team in Rome, we were working on schizophrenia patients, and in one of these studies we found out that the atrophy in a specific part, in a specific aspect of so-called Broca's area, this area that you find here in red, in this reddish spot, was linked to reduced levels of lexical informativeness. That is to say, the ability to select words that are appropriate to a given context. Well, in order to focus on this specific area and on the possibility that this might be an epicenter of a network involved in lexical information processing, we sort out with colleague Cosimo Orgesi here in Udine, in our lab, an RTMS study with transcranic magnetic stimulation technique. We recruited 12 students. They were involved a TMS study in which we inhibited the specific epicenter found atrophic in the schizophrenia patients, and after this inhibition, these students were required to produce stories, and the stories were further analyzed. In a second condition, we asked them to produce other stories and to produce other linguistic tasks after the inhibition on the other epicenter in the other hemisphere, so the same epicenter in the right hemisphere. In a third condition, sham, they were not stimulated at all, but they were told they were stimulated. It was called a kind of a sort of placebo control. Well, in this study, here you can see the results. Here you see what happened after the stimulation in the brain. In white is absence of stimulation. Black is the stimulation to the left hemisphere, the target area. In gray, light gray is the stimulation in the control area. Is the production of words, their speech rate, how many words per minute, the mean length of utterance, how many words per utterance, and their lexical informativeness levels. As you can see, there are no asterisks in words, speech rate, and MLU production, but there are asterisks showing that their lexical informativeness was decreased after the inhibition of this specific epicenter within what is generally called Broca's area in the left hemisphere. And the reduction was significant with regard to what happened after the sham condition and the right hemisphere condition. In a very recent study, we found out that in a cohort of MRI patients, MCI patients with mild cognitive control, were on the way of becoming Alzheimer's because with invasive inspection of their cerebral fluid, we found out they had very high concentration of beta amyloid in their cerebral fluid, so they were on the go to become Alzheimer's. These people had a very important, significant reduction on their lexical informative skills, and this reduction in informative skills was associated with hypoperfusion, which is to say reduced blood stream. In this specific area, you see it on the right, but in reality it's on the left, because this is a non-corrected neuroimaging template. This blue spot here is what we found also in the left hemisphere in controls and schizophrenia fashions. So a significant reduction in the activity of this area, which is to say that they are becoming atrophic in this area, determines a reduction in lexical informativeness. In a further experiment, this is the last one I'm talking to you about, of a few years ago, we performed 3 experiments in a row. This is just one. We found out that in a cohort of non-fluent aphasic patients were chronic and could not benefit from traditional rehabilitation in a story description task. While they were excited, they received excited TDCS, excitatory TDCS stimulation in the epicenter found active in the lexical information in the other studies. They significantly increased their lexical information skills relative to their increase that we observed while we were not stimulating them at all, or we were exciting just Wernicke's area. So overall, these studies suggest that the human brain is organized in complex networks with epicenters. And for language, the networks are quite wide. We just focused on the networks for lexical production. I would like to be very honest in this. We just focus on lexical production, which means that discursive production, grammatical production, pragmatic production, but also linguistic comprehension in the broad sense are subserved also by other networks. So the complexity of all this system now is very, very clear, even if we still have so much to go, so much to do in order to really understand how this complex interaction between cognitive functions and brain structures can be processed. Thank you very much for your attention.